would pass the floor to Martin Pigeon to react on the statements from EFSA.
Thank you. I will not react on everything that has been said, as you might expect. Our focus on these issues is more the EFSA's independence policies. And here I have the unpleasant task to point out at some of the weaknesses of what has been presented in this regard. To start with the beginning, a very important word in this whole discussion is the word resources. Mr. Delercq has mentioned that the average age of an EFSA expert is 55. I would add that the problem is that is typically not paid. And those are people that you would need, that, you know, very competent, and you need to pay them. And that's the underlying problem in this whole discussion. Independence as transparency is a tool, and it costs. You have to acknowledge that efforts were made during the latest recruitment to increase the proportion of scientists working for EFSA without financial ties to the industry that the agency regulates, and this is welcome. The agency's independence policy implementing rules were also rewritten and slightly tightened last summer. That said, the two biggest loopholes in our analysis in EFSA's independence policy are still there. The first one is that the agency assesses the interest of its experts looking at the panel's mandate and not the agency's remit of regulating certain industries. This allows numerous scientists working for EFSA to keep financial ties to most major names in the agro-food business, as indeed EFSA accepts these financial interests within the panel as long as they relate to a different subject than the one being looked at by the panel, and sometimes the distinction seems difficult to explain. And that's something older, but that's still there and very important. In 2011, EFSA's management board changed EFSA's 2002 founding regulation by changing EFSA's original independence rule from a no external influence allowed principle to a policy to only ban, I'm quoting, evident and general conflicts of interests. This has not been reversed today. That means that basically panel members with interests that do conflict even with the panel mandate can still be allowed in the panel as long as the topic they have an interest in does not appear too often in the agenda. In this case, it's about 33%, we're being told. So the underlying problem remains, the consequence of everything I've just described is that any journalist working on any food issue knows that right now he has a 50% chance of finding conflicts of interest at EFSA if he wants to. And all information is public. So the underlying problem is that EFSA's independence policy cannot be serious as we speak because the agency had to adapt it to its operational constraints. And some of these constraints, in particular budgetary ones, I'm insisting, and of course beyond EFSA's power to change alone, but we think that it is really scandalous that an agency with such a responsibility is forced to save even on its independence. Independence. Here you really want to specify very specifically what you're talking about. It has been said yesterday, and I couldn't agree more, that an independent expert doesn't exist because nobody is independent. We're all biased, we all have our ties, etc. The thing is that independence indeed does not mean anything in absolute, but it can mean something in a context, and this is what I think should be highlighted. EFSA is not any scientific organization, it is a specialized administration. About 2/3 of its workload go to assessing the risk posed by products from the agri-food industry. However, if you look at EFSA's website, this is how it defines itself. EFSA is an independent European agency funded by the EU budget that operates separately from the European Commission, European Parliament, and EU member states. I think that if EFSA could define itself as indeed an independent from the other EU institutions as well as from the industries it regulates, I think that might help building trust with the public. Interests, another word that you really want to define very clearly. We think interest should be assessed to exclude any financial link between the person concerned and the industries regulated by the agency within a reasonable cooling off period. We propose 5 years. Very, very importantly, we think that although they do play a role, opinions should not be considered as interests. Why? Because they are impossible to measure. They can and should always be allowed to change. And a bit bluntly, there simply should not be any policing of opinions in a democracy. By contrast, financial ties matter in a measurable way. And actually, they have been measured. The scientific literature has shown, first in the pharmaceutical sector, then in other sectors, in the food sector now very much, that the nature of the funder impacts research results. In other words, scientists are statistically more likely to find positive results for sponsors that have an interest in a given outcome than other studies on the same topic. Regulating interests that are measurable is all the more important that while a conflict of interest is a concrete situation, it is not necessarily perceived as such by the person concerned. Nevertheless, even its very appearance can undermine the public institution's credibility. As a consequence, the discussion between the institution and the person at stake can only be fair if it is based on facts, and I insist, not opinions. So let me really insist on that. The primary objective of any conflicts regulation, actually, it's not only about EFSA, is not to target an hypothetical dishonesty, but to organize and protect the integrity of public decision-making. When someone working for an institution is shown to have a conflict of interest, the whole institution's reputation suffers regardless of the actual harm done by this person. The institution at stake pays for a recruitment or organizational error. And by the way, this kind of measure is very common in the private sector. You can think about non-compete employment clauses, for example. Of course, as was said, some scientists with interests conflicting with those of the agency do have unique competences and expertise, and the agencies must take those into account for its work to be relevant. This is why we recommend that agencies should actively seek the contribution of so-called hearing experts or invited specialists in the meaning of the World Health Organization International Agency for the Research Against Cancer. Very quickly, this means experts do contribute their knowledge to the process, but do not take any part in the actual elaboration, drafting, writing of the opinion. This is why you describe them as hearing experts. They do answer any question that the agency has, but they do not take part in the actual writing of the opinion. That could enable agencies to access any desired knowledge without putting their independence at risk. I'll be very brief. On transparency, I will not expand much because a lot have been said that is relevant for the discussion in the previous panel. It is important to note the goodwill from EFSA's management to, I'm quoting, maximize transparency on data, information and methodologies, including any background documents used in supporting the risk assessment at specific steps in the process. Also, as was said, the reproducibility of its opinions has been identified by EFSA as a key objective, and we entirely support that. Of course, the devil, as usual, is in the details. Two in particular to mention. Legal exceptions. We've heard about the tension between the transparency and privacy in the previous panel. Here, the tension, which can be indeed about transparency and commercially confidential data. It's a very, very detailed discussion to be had. As far as trade secrets are concerned, indeed, current EU legislation do limit EFSA's ability to disclose certain sections of the data it receives, and only the legislator can change this situation. We actually have an idea about this. The ongoing negotiations around the Trade Secrets Directive are an additional threat in this regard. This is a discussion that is in the Parliament right now, so please pay attention. I'll wrap up with two recommendations. One is the prevention of structural conflicts of interest. As EFSA's disclosure abilities are limited by commercial confidentiality clauses, an option would be to change EU laws, easier said than done, I know, so that all regulated product safety is not tested by these products' owners, as is the case now, but by bodies that are strictly independent from them and do their work with blinds. In this way, you could imagine reaching a much fuller data transparency, since nothing in such studies could be linked to a particular company. We think that producers should still pay for the cost of the assessment of the product, as they stand to benefit from a market authorization, but that this should be done via flat fee or tax rather than in ad hoc manner. That is very important because, of course, you want to prevent financial ties between the producers and the testers, but you also want to not create, as is the case now, an entry barrier on the market, because it is actually typically quite expensive to pay for all these studies, and small companies do have difficulties in accessing the market because of that. The existing system is actually favorable to oligopolies, and this must be changed. Finally, let me insist again, it is so important to give such agencies the means of their mission. Not again to quote the facts about the agents, EFSA's expert not being paid. I mean, not only this is unfair, as we are talking about a very significant workload by very specialized individuals, but it is also an obvious incentive to accept financial ties that conflict with the agency's independence. I mean, independence doesn't grow on trees. These people have to make a living. Experts in public regulatory agencies must be paid for their work to enable the independence from the sector they regulate. Thank you.